I struggle to see what the path for a young designer coming out of design school
Yeah.
now is, to a point where they are actually um, doing things more meaningfully than picking up JIRA tickets from a product manager who's prioritized those based on a bunch of business metrics. Um, and they're delivering those solutions with a design system that has been optimized by a team millions of miles away. That to me does not feel like an exciting career. And I worry about design in that way.
James Box.
There you
Hello.
go.
It's so good to have you. Thanks for coming. You were on my names of people that I wanted to talk to quite a while, actually, because we know each other a little bit, and you may not realize, but you have actually played a bit of a role in my own practice and my own thinking over the years, and I've reflected on some of the times we've worked together. So I'm really glad that you're here, and perhaps we can talk about that.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
I'm
definitely if it's a
thinking,
positive thing.
what's that?
Definitely if that's a positive thing, I'm up for that. Yeah.
It's definitely positive, I promise. Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, for people that aren't as familiar, would you be able to perhaps just describe a little bit of your journey, a little bit of your grounding, so people can kind of get a sense of who you are, certainly in the professional sense?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking me to do this, Danny, as well. It's very kind. So I'm James Box. I'm a designer. I think a designer who's ended up being a bit of an entrepreneur, maybe, or certainly interested in entrepreneurship. Um, I've also written a book along the way about user experience design a few years ago. Um, my career has really been agency based. So I've spent the last 6-7 years working at a studio that I co-founded with my colleague, also called James, called Burst. Um, Loosely speaking, Burst is really focused on early stage innovation. So we work with a lot of startups, and we work with some corporates who are trying to act like startups. And prior to that, I was also in an agency. I worked for ClearLeft, which is where you and I worked together, John Lewis. And I was there for 10 years. Really, so most of the time there, I was the director of user experience design, but joined the company as, I think, their first employee. So spent over 10 years there, and saw lots of changes throughout that period. Coming when I first joined, they were sort of web standards based company, and then very focused on user experience design. And then towards the sort of latter stages of my time, they're very much involved in sort of design leadership. So I've always been agency, and I don't really have a vertical as such. It's really across lots of different industries. I'd say my sort of particular niche is like similar to you, I guess, the sort of early stage of a project or an initiative, setting strategy, research, discovery, um, bit of facilitation, bit of leadership. Yeah,
They call that T-shape, don't they, these days?
yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, T-shape sounds good. Yeah.
That's what somebody said to me, and then I started, oh, it's like generalist, isn't it? It's someone that can kind of do a little bit of everything, but not that well, but well enough to be able to kind of maneuver around a lot of different spaces. I think that's how I'd understood it.
Yeah. I think the way I remember T-shape was, you have there's a breadth to what you do, and then potentially there's one slice that you go
You're
deep on.
deep on, yeah.
That being the kind of the bar. I think if I had to put my sort of my depth part, it would be really around trying to understand. I mean, this is a bit of a cliche, but what's the problem we're solving? Why are we
Yeah.
here? Yeah,
Yeah.
who are we doing this for? And
Yeah.
defining that in as clear a possible way as needed, so that everyone around us can understand it. And it sounds such a basic thing, but I think it's weirdly overlooked by so many teams. So yeah,
Even
understand.
now, even now.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, yeah,
I think, that was the thing that I found quite compelling when we first started interacting was that I could see that you had a deep developed practice and like a real toolkit, and it was something that I hadn't really come across. Like, believe it or not, I mean, when we met, I guess I was probably about maybe 10 years in and stuff. And I had just largely been in a lot of enterprises. And I was thinking about this, how, because you said that you come from quite a consultancy background. And I think consultancy, my sense is that it forces you to have a practice because you're constantly going into different situations all the time. Whereas enterprise, my experience was sort of like, well, look, we've got the requirement, this is going back quite a way. It's like you're in a team, you got the requirements, your job is to make the wireframes, this is going back a bit,
Yeah, yeah,
and you have to follow what the PM tells you, and so the space for practice in there was actually kind of like you sort of had one, but you didn't call it names. In those days, most people weren't reading like UX books. I never saw any on any shelves. It just wasn't really a thing. And when I first met you, I was just kind of like, whoa, it's like every time there's a problem, you had this sort of like reasoning and then like, oh, well, let's try this model, let's try that. And it was just like, what is this? This is really interesting. And I'm guessing that that's from your consultancy experience that you cultivated that.
yeah. I mean, it's a nice thing for you to say. I'm not sure I felt the same way when I was talking to you, but I mean, certainly I would say, one of the advantages of being a consultant is, well, there's two advantages, I'd say. Firstly, it's the breadth. Like, as you've said, you're solving different problems on a regular basis. Um, and you have to be pretty adaptive and pretty versatile and pretty open to learning all the time. So the second thing for me was like you there's a lot of more emphasis on communication. So, we were hired, you were my client. So you were hiring us to come and help you in some form. And the sort of, irrespective of the quality of the work we were doing, the precision and the detail in which we were able to communicate was going to be really important. And I think you have to be able to do that in an agency. Um, so yeah, I think that really helps. It's interesting because as you were saying that, I realized that I think we may be in a similar situation today because not so much that um, not so much that people are in enterprises in the same way, but I think there's a lot of people who have spent a lot of designers now come into the industry, go straight into a product team, a large product team, and they spend a lot of time working in a very sort of tightly defined area. Could even be a feature team, right? Where
Yeah.
you're working on a specific thing, picking up JIRA tickets every day. And I think it's quite hard, you become very sort of focused on that problem and that problem intimately, but to get that sort of bigger picture side of
Isn't that
thing.
isn't that like they get very good at converging and their world and life is in convergence as opposed to spending time in divergence of thinking like, are we even solving the right problem? What does everybody understand? Like those types of behaviors and models are not necessarily things that they're tasked to do. It's like much more like coming inwards. That's how I hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, they're probably, I would guess, diverging within that very narrow lane, right?
Yeah, a tiny
um,
diamond.
how can we adjust this button? But no, that's a disservice. But no, I think that's right. Like, it does concern me if I'm honest. Like, I wonder what the path for a designer coming out of design school is now.
Mm.
Um, I think years gone by, it used to be, a common path was to go into agency and you would get this experience. I don't think the agency model really exists at the same scale anymore. And I don't think that path is realistic. And if I'm honest, I think, the better kind of financially, the better route for people now is to go into a big, well-funded product company.
Well, I mean,
So yeah, I worry about that. But yeah, but I think people are perhaps not getting the breadth that that I got from agency and you got after you moved on as well.
I mean, you had quite a kind of unique experience. ClearLeft, I'm a huge fanboy. And I've just spoken to Andy recently, and, for those that don't know, I mean, how would you characterize ClearLeft for perhaps the youth that perhaps might not be as familiar with its sort of entry into the UK scene? Like, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose you hinted at it earlier on when I started working at ClearLeft, which would have been, oh, crikey, well, that would have been mid 2000s. User experience design didn't really, there certainly wasn't an industry. There was perhaps a few people that called themselves user experience designers. Prior to that, you were, I don't know, a usability professional or something along those lines. And then I think so the founders at ClearLeft recognized that, what was happening with people like Adaptive Path in America. And that potentially, there was a rising tide around this discipline of user experience design. And so the agency was really formed around those ideas that underpinned that kind of that user experience movement. And they built up quite a reputation for working with businesses who were interested in that mindset. I think they caught the wave at the right time, and
Yeah.
ClearLeft had this sort of dual aspect to it. Well, actually, three really. So, firstly, there was the client services. Like the projects that we did together. There was also an events business. Part of the organization was to try and build bigger communities around this stuff. ClearLeft put together events like UX London, which is still running, Leading Design. There was a conference called Deconstruct, which was a bit more kind of, I don't know if you ever went to that one, Danny, but that was a little bit more kind of, a bit more eclectic, shall we say.
Yeah. Yeah.
They had this business that was, part events, part client services. And there was also a little bit of a product business as well, because ClearLeft developed a few products along the way. There was a usability testing tool called Silverback.
It had the
And
gorilla on it, didn't it?
it did, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So really, I think it was an agency that was quite pioneering for its time.
Yeah.
There was, as a result, it drew people who had a shared interest in this discipline towards it. And that would be clients like yourself, but it would also be practitioners. And so, for me, it was great. I got to work with some absolutely brilliant people. And I know Andy and Rich and Jeremy, who were the founders there, will often get the credit. But, some of the practitioners that I worked with, some I still work with today, and they're just, phenomenally talented people who, who have a really strong and opinionated and rigorous approach to their work.
Yeah.
Um,
I've
yeah,
experienced that. Yeah. It's quite intense. It was quite intense.
yeah,
I
I think so.
noticed the speed difference between being in an enterprise and then myself actually going to work in ClearLeft for a little bit. And it was just like, the jet engine. It was, I'd said to Andy earlier, it's like, just come in, very, very slow start, gentle, lots of chats. Let's align, let's talk about all the angles, and then head down, and it was very, very quick. And it was sort of like this sort of hyper lean, every day was slightly unstructured and unplanned, but the plan would be formed in the morning, and then hyper alignment between the group I'm in, and we're just like work very, very quickly and effectively. I'd never experienced that before, really, compared to sort of Monday morning meetings, and it's
Yeah,
just a
yeah.
completely different pace. What was it like for you in that, that very early days? I mean, and work, I presume, you said employee number one, so you're sort of working alongside Jeremy and Andy, and Rich. Like, what was? Could you describe that? Like, were you kind of nervous? Did you feel unsure? Did you feel confident in your practice, or where were you in that?
I mean, I think there was a lot of improvisation going on, if I'm honest.
Yeah, which is a skill in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I felt like all of the things that you described in different measures at different points. There was an element of intimidation, that there was this
Yeah.
sort of reputation in these people that I was working with, all of whom were sort of very good communicators. They all had sort of quite well regarded sort of blogs. And so I knew a lot about them when I went into the room. It wasn't like I was starting a new job and meeting these people for the first time. I had some sort of context. And I think that had a little bit of an intimidation factor to it. Uh, but right from the start, I think there was always a sense of common, I guess, purpose around what we were trying to do. And going back to your point about it moving fast, I think there was this, we talked a lot about giving people the autonomy to do the work that they can do best. And so removing some of maybe the structures that you talked about in some of the larger organizations was quite intentional. And so you would have this freedom, which came with this sort of like, I guess two sides to it. Firstly, the side of fear and um, perhaps, a little bit of uncertainty of whether I am good enough to be in this role.
Really?
But
That
also excitement in that, you've come to this place to do good work, and you've been given some opportunities to work on some high profile jobs. And at the same time, we had this culture of learning around us, so that the events were almost really for us to learn as much as everyone else. And yeah, so I think there was two sides to it, and I just really enjoyed that energy, to be honest.
Mhm. Yeah, I noticed that when I was there, how going for lunch was like, we didn't talk about what was on TV, There was these sort of, this Jeremy would come down and there'd be a couple of other characters, and conversations would just suddenly start forming, and it would never be like generally like, oh, let's talk about, like UX. It would usually be about maybe something connected to design more broadly, but someone had read a load of books and it would get quite philosophical, and it was a sort of almost like this avant-garde of design discussion, which like is just utterly alien to me. Like, coming back to the enterprise comparison, like, it just, nobody was talking like that. And so for me, fish out of water in that scene, it was just like, what what's happening? And that, I think, is that culture that you're describing, that perhaps I witnessed a little bit of. Yeah, it
Yeah,
sounds like
no,
it was. Yeah, so go on.
no, it's interesting to hear it from your side as well, because obviously you've been inside the organization as someone
Yeah,
who
both
worked
sides.
there, and also as a client as well. And it's just interesting to hear those observations, because I feel like everyone probably knew that, but it became so normalized that we were having these discussions that, I kind of just thought everyone does this.
Yeah, yeah,
There was a culture of this kind of like brown bag lunch thing, which
yeah.
was, so if people had something to share, they would come in, and it could be very, I mean, you may have even given a brown bag lunch yourself, Danny, I don't know,
I
but
think I did. Yeah, once. Yeah,
yeah. And so there was an element of, yeah, just, sharing to that. It was quite informal, but yeah, I guess it had a bit of performance to it as well. You were almost rehearsing a talk for a bigger audience. So it could be a bit intimidating, I think. But yeah, I mean, overall, I look back very fondly on my time there. I think, we got to work on some brilliant projects, um, with such a range of clients. So I was very lucky to be able to do that, despite despite questioning myself on a regular basis.
yeah. That's interesting. You say that. Like, I keep hearing that. Like, it's like that, to the outsider. There's the director of UX at ClearLeft. Vetted and repeated projects and all this, and yet the experience for you as a human and a person is having some of those feelings of anxiety, or like not quite believing in yourself. Like, I can relate to that, but I wonder for other people listening, they might find that surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk about my own lived experience, but I mean, there's, I think, fundamentally design is about dealing with the uncertain, right? You're
Yeah,
thinking about a thing that hasn't yet, made its way into the world. And whenever you're dealing with uncertainty, I think people can feel very, it can make people feel anxious. And we were conscious of that as an agency. We're coming in to make change, and the people around us are going to feel that anxiety and excitement. And so it's part of what we're feeling as well. And you're making some pretty fundamental decisions, I think, about not just a product, but like what a team are going to be working on for the coming weeks and months. So that it felt like there was pressure there. And then I think also a lot of the methods that we were talking about, that we were using, were fairly novel, and we were sort of encouraged to use to try new techniques. So there's an element of like improvisation there, which comes alongside some nerves.
Yeah, and
Well,
I feel
yeah,
that
sorry.
space that you're talking about, that uncertainty combined with pressure, pressure to create something within quite kind of rigid environments, like that is the essence of a modern designer, I would suggest, and I think we're talking about a real craft here, to be able to dance between the complexities of the client and their anxieties, your own anxieties, and that thing of like, shit, I've got to make something. Like, 3 months time, 2 months time, there's got to be a website. There's got to be something like that. That in itself sounds quite hard, a hard path to tread.
Yeah,
Which,
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced it as well, Danny. I mean, in a funny sort of way, I think when we began working with each other, you were my peer within at John Lewis, effectively, weren't
yeah,
you? So, and I actually do remember, like towards the end of the project, there was a really, I actually remember this moment really fondly when you were
uh,
talking
yeah,
and delivering something to the rest of the team at the end of the project, and it felt, I don't know, I felt that you seemed to me to be in a flow moment, if you like. I felt like you had you'd found the part of the project that or the job that we were trying to accomplish here, and you'd found your rhythm with it, and now it had become your own, and that was really wonderful to see. But I would also imagine at that point you were still nervous as well, and you were
yeah.
still, so,
Well,
um,
on this front, the thing I remember very well on that point, I remember. So there was like some really annoying. Well, okay, let me reframe it. I think that the elements of, so we were at John Lewis at the time, and there were elements within John Lewis that found the nature of design practice, particularly the way that ClearLeft was bringing it in, anxiety producing. Well, I'm talking about delivery managers and project managers, because they don't see a project plan and they don't see certainty, and that's what they operate in, is certainty. And what I hear you describing, to some extent, you need to create a bit of uncertainty in order to be creative, and that and that means adapting to the people you're working with, and working out the best tool in the box and all of this. And I remember having a conversation with you, and it stayed with me like for a really long time, where I came into you as a client. I was just like, they're really worried. They're worried nothing's happening. It's been, a month in or something, and we haven't got designs. Why are things not up on the wall and stuff like this? And it was so interesting what the way you handled that with me. You said, right, and you leant into it and you said, let's do a black hat exercise, which I'd never heard of before. And we got a piece of paper, and you marked out you coloured into a black hat and a white hat, and these four corners, and then it was sort of like, what's the worst things that they could say and could happen, and what's the best things. And I found that as an exercise so insightful, to see a consultant like leaning right into the anxiety, not trying to brush it under the carpet or reassure and say it's all going to be fine. We're experts here, don't worry. It was like, no, let's talk about it. And I've used that one a few times. That's
yeah,
very,
yeah.
very interesting how you did that. Is that something? I mean, I don't know where that came from for you, but it was really interesting.
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say it's a specific tool or technique. I mean, I'd say it comes from critique, so the idea of, bringing in those six thinking
Yeah.
hats.
Critique, yeah.
But, I think there's something about trying to understand people's fears, which can bring out some honesty, which potentially can be missed when, the day-to-day things are happening. And I think what we were doing with that exercise, if I remember rightly, was almost, what would be the worst thing that could possibly happen if
Yeah.
this continued,
Yeah.
Um,
That's right.
and, I think a lot of in those sort of scenarios, a lot of the things that come out are normally right. And what it does is allows us to then think ahead to try and, mitigate for those problems because other people will be sensing them as well. So, yeah, I mean, I guess it's something I think any sort of tool or technique that can get people to talk about their fears, the assumptions they're bringing to the table, and try to sort of like break down the sort of normal kind of rhythms and routines can often like yield these interesting truths about what we're working on, which can often get missed if we're just following dogmatic procedure. So no, I'm glad that worked, and I'm glad you've used it again. I think it's
Yeah.
probably use it with my family.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I'm a magpie. Whenever I see, I guess that practice. I was thinking, I saw some cheesy meme on LinkedIn the other day, and it was sort of like, ideas can be copied, but cultures can't. Or it's harder to copy a culture. And I was thinking about your transition to Burst, and I was thinking about, I was looking at some of the posts you did, and you sort of said how um, the startups that you work with initially have done some innovation, and then sometimes they kind of stall, and they sort of bring you in to sort of reignite that, and perhaps I'm butchering this, but to sort of help them kind of get over some stumbling block of growth, and essentially what they're doing, I'm imagining, is that they're importing some culture, that it's an individual culture with some skills. Is that how you characterize that, or have I killed that?
No, you haven't killed it. I think so. I would say to step back a little bit and give this a bit of context. I think people talk, design for me, sort of broadly speaking, it's this on a spectrum. I think you've got one end of the scale, which we'll call like incremental improvement. So when we talked about the product teams earlier on today, working on a feature, a small feature, they're working on incremental improvement of something that already exists. And then on the other end of the scale, you have, let's call it invention or, innovation, but invention, that coming up with something that hasn't ever existed before. And I think that's on a spectrum. And what happens, I think, is, in the scenario that you're talking about there, I think we're talking about scale ups there. So what we mean is a startup that has sort of graduated, it's probably taken money, it's grown, it has a customer base. It may not be, it's probably revenue generating, but it's probably not profit making yet. And so they're still on this journey to trying to, get to the point where they are kind of established business. And what we've seen as a pattern is that initial kind of spirit of um, adventure and improvisation and innovation that sort of got them drawn towards the business that they were building in the first place seems to sort of dampen as it grows, as the team becomes slightly larger, and they sort of move towards kind of operationalization and towards that kind of right hand side of design that we were talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
It, I kind of said it one time to a colleague. I was like, it just feels like people have forgotten how to innovate here. And I think, it's not a criticism. It's just because, at that point, as a scale up, your intention is to scale, is to try and deliver at, bigger volume and more reliably, more repeatably. But potentially what they forget is like the job is not done at that point. We still need to have that balance of improvement and innovation if we're going to, get to the point we need to be at. So, and so I think there is an element of culture to it, but it's sort of almost like, that culture is dictated by what people's incentives are at that moment. And
Mm.
at that moment in a scale up, when we're, maybe a couple of hundred people, maybe even more, the intention is scale. And what gets put aside a little bit is perhaps the invention side and the innovation side. So a lot of what we try to do with that kind of client would be to just bring back that energy a little bit and try to remember, there are these bigger leaps that we can make. There are potentially, startups outside of outside of our business that are now looking at that and seeing that, potentially we could take a little bit of chunk of this market. Yeah, and that's actually where the name Burst came from. Really, it's really about trying to bring that kind of energy and that leap forward to
Ah.
people. That's how, yeah. So with scale ups, I'd say that's particularly the case. With startups, I guess less so, because actually, really, it's much more at this point kind of embryonic. Most of the people will work in the very early stage. It's potentially putting shape to that original concept. Whereas the scale up, something is pretty much established. There could be, there's probably product and design teams, and more towards like an enterprise.
There's an industry, an established industry, and established kind of codified, job roles and things like that for that whole space in the design spectrum that you talked about. But when it gets into the divergent space, it's a little bit more misty and and untrodden, I would suggest. Although that's changing all the time, isn't it? With a lot of investment in the startup space. Burst, I was curious, because one of the hot topics with old folk who are sort of freelancing, such as myself, is like fractional work and stuff. And that, I think, is how you guys either operate now or certainly started. And you were looking at all these like different models like equity and stuff like that, which for me, again, it was the first time I'd ever kind of considered something like that. When I heard you
Mm.
talk about it, I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. Would you like to share a little bit about that, like how the model works? Because obviously startups don't always have lots of money, but they
Yeah,
need
yeah,
they need the help that money would buy. But you have a different way of doing that at Burst, is that right?
yeah. I mean, actually, this also came from ClearLeft in a way. Sort of when I was at the sort of latter stages of my career, there we worked with a company called Matter, and it was a couple of journalists. A guy called Bobby Johnson, I think, who's still a very kind of prominent Silicon Valley tech journalist. But they wanted to build a long form journalism platform. Bobby was friends with Andy Budd, I think. They were very early, and almost as a kind of a side project. We worked with them on building up some initial kind of brand presence and their sort of initial user experience. They were going to go through with a bit of a paywall, and rather than being paid for that, ClearLeft took some equity in the business.
Right.
Um, they did actually get acquired, which was quite interesting. But the thing I took away from it was that the incentives between the agency, us in this case, and the founders of the business were far more aligned than they would be on a traditional, client services relationship. We
Because you
were
got skin in the
fundamentally
game.
exactly, yeah, yeah. And so James and I really enjoyed that model. James is my business partner at Burst, and we one of the things we wanted to experiment at Burst was with using that business model with startups. And so for sort of one or two clients a year, we would work in exchange for equity, like people talk about sweat equity or whatever.
Sweat equity.
Sweat equity, yes,
I've
it's a
never heard of
pretty,
that.
that's a
Sweat
nasty term,
equity.
yeah.
Why do they say sweat equity?
I guess the equity you're getting is in exchange for the work you're doing and the sweat that you are
That's great.
producing as a result of that. It's it's not a particularly pleasant metaphor, is it?
I quite like it. I'm putting that over sort of blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah,
But yeah, okay. So sweat
yeah,
equity. That's the model. Yeah, interesting.
yeah. I don't think that's quite the same thing as fractional in this case, but maybe we can come back to that. Um, what I would say is, we spent a few years doing this, and fundamentally, James and I were doing it as a business model exploration, but also because that's where we wanted to be working. We loved working with founders who had a deep connection to what they were doing, whether it was the technology they were building, or the business model they were creating. But being close to those people was where we found that we could have the biggest impact. And at that point, I think ClearLeft had got to a situation where it was now working on sort of design leadership and scaling design teams. And for me, just as a designer, I didn't feel as connected to what I was doing at ClearLeft, and that's one of the reasons we decided to experiment with this business model at Burst. To cut a long story short, though, it doesn't really work.
Really? Tell me about that.
I would say, like one of the reasons that it's essentially borrowing some of the kind of ideas from venture capital, right? So you're looking to spot a good business early, to take some equity in something that would potentially, lead to a sort of payout further down the line. Firstly, like VCs get, access to hundreds of companies all the time. They're picking from a huge number of people.
Portfolios of different interested parties. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I think what we were doing was using that as a way to work with people that potentially couldn't afford what we needed to do at the time.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is, like, if you're thinking about that as a business model in terms of financial remuneration, the payoffs are the cycles are quite long.
Yeah.
For someone to go through potentially like 2 or 3 capital events before you might. So it's quite. I think it's a sort of theoretically brilliant idea.
Yeah.
And I wish it worked, and I'd love to have tried it at a bigger scale. But we found it difficult to make it to work, to be our sole revenue model, or business model. And so we had to sort of complement that with working with corporates as well. So actually, our mix is more like, I would say, being candid, like 60-70% of our revenue will come from larger organizations.
Yeah.
I'd probably include the scale ups in that, to be honest, because they are, they have kind of much bigger or deeper pockets. And then the rest of that, the revenue would, or equity in this case, would come from those smaller companies. So I think it needs to be a blended thing, unfortunately.
And does it, given that you changed the model back to a bit more of a familiar consulting model and you're working for bigger clients, is it starting to feel a bit more like your old job, or does it still feel very different because you're a founder and you're in a slightly different role? Like, does it feel different to your old job in that respect?
It feels different in the sense that we sort of insist on working with the people that are, whether it's a founder or someone in the C-suite.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we try where possible to, because we believe it's in the interest of the client, that if you want to have the best impact with our work, that's where we need to be operating.
Yeah.
And so when I say corporate stuff, it will often be, for instance, the most recent project we worked on was an internal innovation for a large IT services business that they'd created, and they were now offering to their clients as part of their consulting. But it hadn't sort of been productized. It didn't really have an established kind of value proposition yet. It was still almost like a startup within the business itself. So there was room to kind of shape how that would be expressed to the market. There was room to shape the business model. And then, obviously user experience and things along those lines. So it still has a similarity, if you like, to working with the startups. But yeah.
A different flavor, although your name's on the door now. so it says that responsibility, as you take people in. I wonder, like, just moving towards a little bit of the future, and something I was looking through some of the things that you've written about, and it's like the whole market's changing, and AI is, it's everywhere, and it's in lots of people's conversations. You seem to have a sense of optimism about the future. Like, what I saw you were you're trying to set up some kind of festival around optimism, and you've written about an article that you have every right to be optimistic, and I just wonder where this like thread is come from for you, like, because
Mm.
some people feel very pessimistic about the future at the moment, but you have some optimism. Like, could you help me understand that?
Yeah, I
What's
mean,
the secret?
it is. I think what it boils down to me is, I think to be a designer, fundamentally, you need some level of optimism. You know, essentially, you need to believe that you can affect the future in a positive way. And, you know, I think in some ways, to contrast that, the enemy of that is cynicism. You know, the idea that by pointing out what's wrong in the world, we are making progress. I mean, potentially, but so for me, what the sort of the idea of optimism is that we can use that um, as a kind of founding belief to how we're approaching our work. That it's within our purview, it's within our ability, it's within our collective team ability to be able to try and make an improvement to the world. And that actually, when we look back in history, humans have been pretty good at making, you know, significant advancements, whether it's with technology or whatever. So I think it's about trying to believe that, you know, that big change is possible. And as designers, I think we have this luxury of being able to try and imagine what that future might look like, and then bring that future into the world, albeit, you know, in a slightly different form to how we initially imagined it. So I think optimism is to me, it's like a grounding belief in the way that I work.
A starting
Uh,
point.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and I would say, like, it's, you know, just to contrast it, it's not blind optimism. It's not just, you know, let's, you know, close our eyes and jump into the future. It's that we're still trying to embrace the structure of something like skepticism, like you talked about the sort of black hat exercise earlier on. And but I think, you know, um, the idea is that we can bring that kind of sense of optimism to everyone around us, and now that's where I think you can start to see great change happen. You know, um, so yeah, I feel like optimism is something which in this is interesting. Like in certainly in Europe, and I think maybe in the UK, is often viewed as I don't know. People sort of frown a little bit
No,
when
it's
you
a bit
talk about.
naive or something, or
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
not the default setting, certainly. Whereas
yeah.
Americans generally have a more kind of positive beat to it, right? Is that what you're implying?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think people, yeah, like you said, it is a bit more of a default setting, and culturally, that can sometimes feel a bit sort of, you know, bit of a bad taste for some people in Europe. But I think we've got, like I said, I think we've got, you know, every right to feel optimistic about um, applying design in the way we know it can be a design. It can be applied to make better futures. And I've seen that happen time and time again, you know, and so I want more people to have that belief as well.
Is that is
So
that
that's where it comes from. Yeah.
is that sort of, if we apply that to AI, that there's there's we're not going to need to work, universal income, like it'll be a utopia, or we're all going to be like slaves to AI, and we're losing our humanity, and there's those sort of two juxtapositions of, and like, does your optimism orientate you to one of those two sides, or somewhere in the middle? Like, how do you
Mm,
bring that in when you're dealing with AI, which at the moment it feels a bit anxiety making the way things are going for me. So
yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to ask you that question as well, but I would say for me, you have to hold both of those sides. You know, because this is a fundamentally unprecedented technology, right? We actually haven't seen what this can do yet, and it's not it's about sort of almost accepting that there is a path that hasn't yet been defined, and that there are risks some of which you've already mentioned, but there are also benefits. And that really what we're trying to do is understand what the implications of this technology could be. And the only real way I think to do that is not to kind of just sit in a room and philosophize about it. Is to try it, is to make things, is to do things, and just try and do that in a sort of conscious way. You know, where you're you're aware of what the kind of moral obligation you have around this technology is, as much as the sort of business model. Um, so yeah, I think it's a difficult one because we don't have a sort of toolkit or a kind of, you know, we can't really look back in history
No.
and say, you know, I mean, you know,
You
closest
can't
thing we
compare it
we
to cars. You can't compare it to electricity. Like you know, as tempting as it is, it's just, this is like multi, you know, dimensional. It'll affect almost every facet of society. Whereas, you know, I feel like in those other paradigms, it sort of, you could find insulation from some of those disruptions. You could find areas that would be completely unaffected. You know, like therapy, completely unaffected whether there's electricity or not. You know, whereas with AI, it's like it's hard to find anything that wouldn't eventually be swallowed up. I think that's the paradigm shift that I can sense with it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's just this element of trying to understand this as a new material, and in and with any new material, we don't really know how it's going to work best, you know, and we're learning. We're seeing some bad things, we're seeing some good things. Um, so yeah, you know, we've got a long way to go. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if we approach this with an optimistic mindset, we hold those kind of two ends of the spectrum in our minds, that there are negative and positive consequences, and then use a sort of moral compass to try and guide us towards the things that actually are making meaningful progress in the world. I think we can sort of yield some great things, and you know, there are some pretty amazing developments happening out in the world with AI as well. So, but yeah, curious to know what you think, Danny. You know, what's your
I
take?
think I think it's a little bit like climate change for me, in that I have to hold dualities to it. I can't say one thing is going to be true and therefore the other thing is not going to be true. So I can't say AI is bad and I can't say it's good. It has to be both. And I think that duality extends out to, when I look at the macro picture of it all, of huge data centers and swallowing up resources and you know, unregulation and things like that, I feel really concerned, and anxious about it, and kind of, you know, I've got a 4.5-year-old boy. Like, what should he even study? Like, you know, like, it just, that uncertainty and that lack of kind of care that seems to be being applied on a global scale. So that I have that perspective. But then, as with climate change and things, there's that sort of, okay, so zoom down to your reality, your world, your streets, your job, you know. And then I'm sort of, you know, I put AI on my LinkedIn the other day, you know, as my title, and you know, I it's changed how I work. I've going into gigs now and I'm building things, you know, like without invitation in some cases. I'm like, hey, here's a dashboard, you know, and here's an agent that will do that for what? How did you do that? You know, oh, well, there's a Copilot Studio. Like, I just asked IT and then they give me a license and I've just built it, you know, and even the regulations within Gov is like hasn't caught up. So you can just kind of bit Wild Westy, which for someone like me, I'm like Mr. Maverick, so I just kind of go there and build stuff and do stuff. So it's really appealing to a part of me that likes to be emboldened and unshackled by having to work through developers and stuff who would be the gatekeepers for me, because I'd have to work through them, and now in some cases I don't need to. So I guess it's just that duality, and for my own future in career, I you know, I'm like, you know, what is UX now and what is design now, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
trying my best to get ahead of that wave, because I feel like there's this whole thing where they say there's going to be like universal income and all that, and I'm like, yeah, but there'll be that stage where people get rinsed out of jobs and they haven't got all the the backup systems and society haven't adjusted yet. And then you'll be caught in this washy middle stage of, and then there'll be some people that maybe got a bit ahead of it. So, which is really like anxiety reducing way to think about it. But that's the relationship I've formed at this point. Does that make any sense?
Total sense. Yeah. I mean, as a practitioner, I'm experiencing similar things to you, just
Yeah.
extraordinary difference in terms of this, there used to be a huge lag, didn't there, from the moment of research to the point of tangible, you know, product in some way. And that lag is almost zero. We're talking hours now. So extremely exciting. I feel, as designers, we're often quite enamored by novelty. And so that
Yeah.
can be quite intoxicating as well. I'm definitely guilty of this. So, but yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I hold all those thoughts that you have around, the potential existential threats that come. I also have children and think about
Mm.
it from that side as well. Um, and I think what I like to, what I the way I try to approach it is to contemplate it, to reason about it, to use it, to think it, to try and work out what its edges are a little bit. And
Yeah.
obviously listen to people like yourself and others who are doing this in interesting ways. And I just think we're in that point now where, most people think of AI as an LLM, let's be honest.
Yeah.
But we're really on like the cusp of something here. So um
Well, this
I
this
feel
is
like
your. I read your Hey Siri, who's driving now,
we're
and
right,
I
yeah.
don't know. Did you come up with that? This is amazing. Like your stages. So for those that don't know, you did stage 1, AI is a tool. Stage 2, AI is the assistant. Stage 3, it's the collaborator. Stage 4, it's the delegate. Stage 5, the orchestrator, and stage 6, it's the peer. Is that did I get that right? I don't. Where are we? Are we on like tool or stage 1, or do you think we're further down?
I think most people I think if we took a look at it society wide, yeah. I mean that model came from, me. We had a really interesting project this year where we worked with a startup called MindMax who are building an educational platform. And the the platform is essentially uh, it's an audio driven learning tool. So you can start the app and you can basically describe what you want to learn, and then you go into a lesson with a notable expert from that field that's been AI generated. So let's say it's quantum physics, you might get Robert Oppenheimer or someone, and uh, you also go into that lesson with a study buddy or a sidekick who's also AI generated. And this is an audio driven lesson. So we could talk about that product, but it was, to me, what was so um, enlightening about it in terms of what impact AI is going to have is it was the first time I experienced a product which I felt was what people mean by AI native. The entire experience, or 90% of the experience for the user, was generated on the fly, which, whether that's through voice or even the UI itself.
But
And
bespoke to what the person is doing, so
yeah, yeah.
it's unique each time.
Yeah,
Prob-
yeah. It's emergent effectively. The experience you're having is based on your last response, but because it's an audio and also somewhat visual experience, you've just got this incredibly sort of like um every experience for every different user is going to be different. And I think we talked about this in UX for a long time, personalization, but just to suddenly be able to deliver it so quickly was extraordinarily exciting. And it made me wonder like how far it would go, you know.
yeah.
Um, so that was a sort of us trying to abstract out, is it plausible to actually see a world where we move from AIs being, as they are now, kind of fundamentally a tool that we ask to accomplish a small task for us,
Yeah.
to the point where it's a peer or a collaborator. And at first it seemed kind of preposterous to me, but the more I kind of reasoned about it and the more I thought about it, I could see how potentially that would become ingrained in people's lives. And it did feel plausible to me. And actually now I think, a few months after writing that article, agents are embedded in so many people's lives.
I've been no, sorry, go on.
No, that's yeah, that so I do see a way where, we are operating with AI as peers to ourselves, and actually AI's operating as peers to one another as well.
Yeah, that's the scary
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, so the kind of it felt ridiculous to me when I started thinking about this, but now I do see this as quite plausible. So that's where the article came from. Anyway. And
No, it's fascinating. Yeah, and I'll link to it for people that want to read it. I think that's it's helped me kind of like orientate a little bit. And sometimes I'm doing things and I'm like, oh, what stage is that? I'm working for a government service at the moment, and it's like a data service, and I kind of had realized that I could start creating these Copilot agents and feeding not actually the data that the service works on. That's probably down the track, but just internal usage stats and subject matter stuff. And then I was like, oh, I can add the agent into the calls. And then I was like, oh, it could actually be there on the calls as a subject matter expert, so that when people say stuff, it can kind of fact check it and say, actually, the service doesn't work that way, or it's this way, and stuff like that. And I started to, it was just kind of like a bit what you're alluding to. I was like, oh wow, that's not just, that's moving into something different. That's like more like an assistant now.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm
Yeah.
curious
So
to
I'm
know
not,
what sort of tools are you using in that process? Are you encoding platforms, and are you?
Copilot Studio and Power Automate and all the integrations that Copilot Studio comes with. It's funny. I actually said to the agency I'm with, I was just like, everybody should be training not in Gemini and Chat GPT, should be training Copilot Studio, because that's what all the enterprises have. And it's actually quite easy to use, to create agent, because it's integrated into their own environments. So you end
Yeah,
up
yeah,
making tools that they use. And a lot of the big governments, like, they've all got these tools. Like, they don't, it's just been added as another icon in the Office suite, but nobody ever clicks on them. They just have it as the browser assistant, so they can ask it to reword an email. But you actually
yeah,
get the agent creators. A lot of it's all there out the box. I don't think anyone's really kind of played around with it. I mean, I can see in the environments I'm in, I can see who else has made agents, and it's a handful,
mm, yeah,
across a huge government department. So yeah, I think that will probably be very different in a year's time, and I don't know what that looks like. Yeah.
yeah,
Who's
yeah,
checking who's making what? Who knows? Yeah.
yeah. And I'm interested to, I think playing with it is the way to find out. As I said earlier on, I kind of want to see what outcomes this is actually going to create in the world
Yeah.
as well. And um, yeah, I think that for me, my experience is, it's hard to actually see how this is working at scale. See lots of promise and potential, but I'm just wondering, like, in your role, are you seeing this process that you're using actually ending up in users' hands as well, or is it at this point still prototyping? It's still exploring.
Um, internal users, yes, that's already started to happen. I think the tool that I should have done by the end of January will, I'm making like a user insight tool, so people can just email things that they found out or attachments. They just send it to a mailbox. It hoovers it up, synthesizes it, put it into a database, and then you can interrogate the database as a product owner and stuff like that, and say, oh, if we do this, will it be impactful? And it'll be a RAG system, so it will only use the data it's got in its knowledge base. And that's, yeah, as an internal user, that could be used. But I think what's happening in the government department I'm in is that they're going, oh, and I'm obviously, when I'm showing people, I'm like, it'd be quite interesting if our users had stuff like this too. And that I think is starting, that sort of seed is being planted. So I imagine end users, yes, but internal users, yeah, probably in the next few weeks, actually. So,
Yeah, yeah, it's
but I'm a
interesting. Yeah,
UX guy. Like, what? I'm making what am I now? Like a workflow guy? Like, it's confusing.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's confusing job title wise, but it's still user experience design in its purest sense. What you're doing, um, you just happen to have a new piece of technology or tool at your disposal. I think to be able to accomplish what you want to be able to accomplish. And I think it's just the strange thing is how exponentially faster and more rigorous you can be, which is crazy. I mean, when the speed of delivery almost gets to nothing, which is obviously a way off. I'm not trying to, but really, the power comes from what the problem we're actually solving is at the start, right? And I feel like that's where designers still have a fundamental role.
Yeah,
So, you know,
yeah.
um, yeah, I'm excited. I'm trying to embrace it as much as possible myself. But I think you sharing how you're experiencing this is going to be something that I'd love to see more of the industry doing because everyone's working it out right now. Um,
Mm.
and I think we're very focused on the shiny things and the sort of like throwaway things. But really, it's how do we use this tool to make like meaningful progress? Creating you know, insights and interesting new knowledge, not creating like, Studio Ghibli shots of my friends.
Well, we started with solution, and we're trying to work our way back to problem. And I think that, coming right back to the start of your of our conversation, you said that essentially it's still about trying to work out the problem we're trying to solve. And I think AI has kind of messed that up a bit because it's kind of said, here's a solution. Now find loads of problems. And that just inherently like never works that well. I mean, I think ultimately, yes, you can probably get there, but I think it's like disrupted our design process by giving us this shiny thing. But I guess it won't be shiny for long, but and then perhaps we'll get back to, and I've already seen some interesting stuff where people are saying like, here's the new diamond, but with AI, and we have to rethink our design process, given that you can just prototype or build in minutes, or as you say, no time. That does change the game. So are you, just to sort of bring us to some conclusion then, where are you optimistic about the future, given what we just talked about for design? Let's keep it in the bounds of design for a minute. Are you optimistic in that space, or as Andy said, we're all going to be done in about 4 or 5 years? Where do you sit on that?
I think the I'm concerned. I'm hinted at this earlier, and I'm concerned about the trajectory of design at the moment. I feel like as a profession, it's shrinking in terms of impact, and I feel like I said earlier on, I struggle to see what the path for a young designer coming out of design school
Yeah.
now is to a point where they are actually um, doing things more meaningfully than picking up JIRA tickets from a product manager who's prioritized those based on a bunch of business metrics. Um, and they're delivering those solutions with a design system that has been optimized by a team millions of miles away. That to me does not feel like an exciting career. And I worry about design in that way. I
Yeah.
think where I see some sort of beacons of hope, if you like.
Yes, give us some optimism.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of talk about designer founders now. There's a lot of talk about
Yes,
people moving towards, building their own businesses.
as you
And
have done.
yeah, to an extent. I mean, it's still an agency, but I mean, when it's a product business, a service, or whatever it might be, I think designers are in a really good position to be able to do this. They have the right mindset. And I think if you have that sort of experience of thinking about what the right problem to solve is, thinking about that in the business context as well as the user context, picking up on some of the stuff we did in the past around lean startup and then I think there is a path there for people to think about using design for solving business scale problems. And I think AI potentially opens up that to a lot more people than was, available in the past. So that would be my sort of hope, is that we can start to sort of think about design in the way that it can be used for solving more kind of business level problems, and that we're not going to be channeled into this sort of mechanistic factory like setting that I'm seeing with a lot of product teams these days. I know it seems sort of negative about it, but I think sort of the operationalization of design to me is almost a little bit of an antithesis to what design can do. We're reducing its power by so much.
Yeah.
And I realize that these two things have to exist. You still need to be able to do incremental improvement. But I think we're missing out on the real sort of potential of design to connect to what people need in the world, and bring those kind of, imagine and invent those solutions for people. So I'm hopeful that the tools that we've got now at our disposal, like some of the ones that you've mentioned, will enable us to do that in a more meaningful way. I said to someone the other day, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but I'd like design to have its vinyl moment.
Have his what moment?
Its vinyl moment.
A
So,
vinyl.
I mean, vinyl as in like records. So, you've got vinyl, which is now flying, right? I've walked past a record shop on the way in here, and they're selling like lovely, beautiful gatefold albums for 30 quid or whatever. But vinyl's back, and it's really popular. It has it's really a something that culture has decided it wants in the world. And I feel like design needs to sort of find its own little vinyl moment now, and work out what it's really good at. And potentially some of these tools help us do that. I think we're trying to work it out. So if there's an optimistic side, it would be that is, let's use it to try and engage our entrepreneurial innovation mindsets, and think about how we can, channel it in that direction, rather than adjusting the border radius of a button for 3 years.
James, I think that's a great note to end on. Yeah, that's James's Christmas message for designers. But yeah, thank you for coming.
No, it was a real pleasure. Lovely to see you, Danny. Hopefully we get a chance to meet up in person soon.
Yeah, I may well be doing some Brighton trips at some point, but thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for coming on. Thank you, James, and Merry Christmas.
Yep. Happy New Year, mate. Cheers.
Awesome.